court glitters with gold, but beneath the jewels lies silence. Candles burn along marble corridors as a young woman kneels before a throne, her breath steady, her eyes trained to never rise higher than the king's feet. The music fades. The courtiers whisper. Tonight she is not a guest, she is proof of power. For centuries, kings measured their authority not only through conquest or crown, but through control over women. Behind every empire's splendor stood those forced to embody its order. Wives turned into symbols, concubines turned into trophies, and slaves dressed as goddesses to decorate tyranny. To rule men, kings needed loyalty. To rule women, they needed obedience. But obedience wasn't given. It was rehearsed, displayed, and performed for the world to see. History remembers their palaces as magnificent, their courts as divine. But it forgets the women who lived inside them, trained to please, silenced to survive, and humiliated to remind everyone who ruled. What began as devotion soon became theatre. And what was called love was often ceremony built not from affection, but from fear. This is the story of the role no woman chose, the throne beneath the throne, where power demanded worship in silence. Every empire needed a mirror. For kings, that mirror was the women who surrounded them. Their beauty reflected glory, their silence reflected order. To keep that mirror flawless, rulers polished it with fear. The history of monarchy is not only the story of thrones built from conquest, but of obedience carved from women's lives. Royal power thrived on symbolism. The king stood as the embodiment of the divine, the sun that gave light, the father of his realm. His court revolved around him like planets, and the women closest to him became celestial bodies orbiting his will. Queens embodied purity, mistresses embodied pleasure, concubines embodied loyalty. Their value lay in contrast, their existence in comparison. Each role reinforced his supremacy. Ancient Assyrian kings kept lists of women according to rank: royal wives, concubines, entertainers, slaves. Their duties were recorded like temple inventories. The women themselves became offerings to the god of empire. In Mughal courts, beauty was taxation. Noble families sent daughters to the palace as political gifts, and refusal was treason. The Ottomans perfected the system, a labyrinth of silk corridors where hundreds of women waited, trained, and disciplined under the shadow of a single man's desire. The politics of obedience began long before the bedroom. It started in philosophy. Kings believed the natural order of the universe depended on hierarchy: heaven above earth, man above woman, ruler above ruled. The idea was seductive: power as destiny, submission as virtue. Monarchs used religion to sanctify their appetite. Clerics preached that obedience from women mirrored obedience to God. Every bow of a queen's head was a prayer for stability. But the illusion of divine harmony required constant performance. Kings could not appear vulnerable, therefore someone else had to be humiliated. The spectacle of female submission reminded courtiers that even intimacy bowed to the crown. When a wife knelt, a nation obeyed. When a mistress wept, the court applauded the king's strength. European monarchies refined this theatre into etiquette. Louis XIV ruled France through choreography, the ballet of servitude known as Versailles. Every gesture of the royal women was scripted: how to walk, how to laugh, how to faint with grace. Their bodies became instruments of propaganda, their presence proof that the king's control extended from battlefield to boudoir. The pattern repeated across civilizations. In Persia, royal wives could not eat until the king lifted his cup. In China's Forbidden City, concubines bowed 3 times before entering the emperor's chamber, and again when leaving, proof that even pleasure required ritual submission. In the Ottoman harem, women were ranked by titles that measured proximity to the sultan's bed rather than their lineage. The closer they were, the tighter the chains of protocol became. Humiliation disguised itself as honor. A woman paraded in jewels before foreign envoys was not being celebrated. She was being displayed, a living testament to male supremacy. The richer the adornment, the deeper the silence. Gold covered the bruises of invisibility. Political control of women also protected dynasties. A queen's virtue secured the legitimacy of heirs. Her obedience guaranteed stability. Rumors of infidelity could topple empires. Kings therefore turned suspicion into policy. Medieval European courts employed female guards to watch queens, while Mughal emperors kept eunuchs to police harems. Surveillance became love's twin. The humiliation extended beyond flesh into identity. Royal women were renamed upon entering service, their pasts erased. In the Ottoman palace, a girl from Greece or the Caucasus received a Turkish name, new religion, and new silence. She ceased to exist except as function. In France, royal mistresses were renamed with titles of estates, Madame de Pompadour, Madame du Barry geography, replacing humanity. Ownership disguised as affection. Every gesture reinforced hierarchy. When kings granted favor, it was theater. A hand on the shoulder, a necklace around the throat. These were not gifts, they were symbols of control. To accept them was to submit publicly. Refusal meant exile or death. History remembers a few who resisted, wives who spoke, mistresses who plotted, but their defiance always ended as warning. The machinery of obedience also served political purpose. By dividing women into ranks and rivalries, kings prevented unity. In harems, alliances were discouraged, jealousy was cultivated. In European courts, queens despised mistresses, mistresses despised courtiers, courtiers whispered against queens. The fragmentation kept the system stable. A united sisterhood could threaten the throne, an anxious one protected it. To maintain this structure, kings surrounded themselves with myths. Poets romanticized their cruelty. Chroniclers wrote that women longed to serve. Artists painted submission as grace, the bowed head, the veiled gaze, the delicate wrist raised in surrender. These images traveled farther than armies, teaching generations that obedience was beauty and silence was strength. Yet beneath the velvet rituals, the politics of humiliation served a simpler need, reassurance. Kings feared what they could not control: desire, emotion, the unpredictability of love. By reducing women to roles, they tamed the chaos of intimacy. Power was easier to maintain when affection was replaced by protocol. Sometimes the cruelty was open. Eastern monarchs staged competitions where women danced for favor, the losers dismissed in disgrace. European courts whispered with scandals of favoritism trials, where queens were interrogated for imagined sins. A ruler's appetite became law, and law became theater. The humiliation of women was not collateral damage, it was governance by design. From Assyria to France, the pattern was identical. The crown depended on submission. The obedience of one woman symbolized the obedience of millions. A disobedient queen was political disaster. A humiliated one was insurance. The monarchy fed on appearances, and the appearance of female humility was its most sacred currency. By the time Europe called kings divine and the East called them shadows of God, the system was complete. The humiliation of women had become invisible, absorbed into ritual, praised as grace. No decree proclaimed it, yet every court practiced it. Power did not need to shout, it only needed to be mirrored, and women were forced to become that mirror. Thus the politics of obedience endured, shining through centuries of silk and ceremony. Behind every proclamation of divine order was a trembling silence, behind every crown a bowed head. The thrones glittered, but their foundations were built on the quiet submission of those who could not leave. To become a royal woman was not a privilege, it was a sentence delivered in gold. Across empires, selection for a king's service began not with affection, but with inspection. Beauty was not admired, it was audited. In ancient palaces, scouts roamed villages searching for faces that matched the ruler's taste. In the Ottoman Empire, imperial agents scoured conquered lands from the Balkans to the Caucasus, capturing or purchasing girls between the ages of 8 and 14. Their families were told it was an honor. It was, in truth, a quiet abduction. Once chosen, the girls were brought to the palace gates. They were stripped of their clothes, bathed by strangers, and examined for scars, birthmarks, or deformities. Officials measured their hair, weighed their bodies, even checked their teeth. Those deemed imperfect were dismissed. Those deemed suitable were renamed. Their real names were erased from record, replaced with Turkish, Persian, or Arabic ones that symbolized beauty: Gul, Yasmin, Safiye. To erase the name was to erase the past. In Europe, the process was more polite, but no less cruel. Royal courts were filled with daughters of noblemen sent as ladies-in-waiting, a euphemism for hostages of grace. They were educated to serve the queen, but trained to attract the king. Their families traded innocence for influence, and their beauty became their dowry. Behind every painted smile at court was a woman who understood that attention could build or destroy a dynasty. In Mughal India, selection took on a spiritual disguise. Women were chosen not just for looks, but for voice, wit, and rhythm. The emperor's courtesans were expected to embody art itself, dancers, poets, scholars of desire. But every lesson carried an unspoken rule. Their brilliance existed only for male gaze. Their minds could shine, but only within the walls of devotion. Training began the moment selection ended. In Ottoman harems, the Khalfa's senior attendants taught newcomers to walk without sound, to speak only when addressed, to sleep on command. Posture was discipline, silence was virtue. The corridors of Topkapi Palace echoed with whispers of instruction: how to bow, how to smile, how to hide fear. Physical control came first. Girls learned to stand for hours in rigid poses, balancing trays, holding veils, waiting for the sound of footsteps that determined their fate. Emotional control came next. They were taught to never show longing, anger, or love. To desire was dangerous, to remember was fatal. In France, the art of submission was performed through refinement. The court of Louis XV trained women to speak in measured tones, to blush gracefully, to faint at compliments. Their gestures were rehearsed until spontaneity disappeared. A woman who laughed too freely was called vulgar. One who spoke too wisely was called dangerous. The goal was perfection without identity. Every empire had its tutors of obedience. Eunuchs in the Ottoman harem served as both guardians and enforcers, mediators between the king and his women. They taught the rules of service and punished disobedience with confinement or deprivation. In European palaces, older courtiers acted as moral instructors, ensuring that young ladies learned to behave like porcelain, admired but never touched without permission. The women themselves formed a hierarchy sharper than any sword. At the bottom were attendants and slaves, nameless hands who dressed, cleaned, and endured. Above them were favorites, concubines, and consorts, each vying for attention. At the top stood the queen, or Haseki Sultan, the most visible prisoner of all. Power in these spaces was never freedom, it was survival through submission. To outsiders, the palaces gleamed with elegance. Inside, they operated like factories of perfection. Women awoke before dawn to lessons in music, poetry, posture, and restraint. They learned to smile through hunger, to praise through humiliation. Discipline was the currency of beauty. A single misstep, a misplaced glance, an unsanctioned word could end their life or erase their existence from records. In some cultures, these lessons were framed as spiritual. In Persia, women were told they were vessels of divine grace, and obedience elevated them closer to godliness. In Mughal India, poets described concubines as angels bound to earth. But this celestial language only masked servitude. Heaven had rules, and disobedience was sin. There were rewards for mastery. The most obedient rose in rank a new chamber, finer clothes, the privilege to serve wine or recite poetry for the king. Some achieved influence, whispering advice from behind curtains or shaping alliances through pillow talk. But this influence was fragile, built on favor, destroyed by a glance. The humiliation was subtle. A woman could be summoned at night and dismissed by dawn. Her beauty might be praised in the morning and mocked by evening. Rumors could erase her faster than disease. Each day was a performance, each gesture a negotiation. They lived not by laws but by moods. Even those who became legends like Roxolana, who rose from slavery to power beside Suleiman the Magnificent, paid for it with their silence. Her letters reveal longing not for wealth or politics, but for freedom to walk outside the palace gates. The higher she climbed, the deeper her cage became. Training extended to illusion. Women were schooled to believe their captivity was honor. In songs and court rituals, obedience was celebrated as divine femininity. They were told they were chosen by destiny, favored by the gods. The truth was simpler. They were selected because they could be controlled. For those who failed to adapt, punishment was swift. In the Ottoman palace, rebellion meant being sent to the old palace, a place of exile where forgotten women lived out their days unseen. In Europe, disobedient mistresses were banished to convents, silenced under vows of repentance. The world outside the palace was forbidden, and the world inside was a performance without end. And yet, beneath the layers of submission, small rebellions survived. A secret glance exchanged between women, a letter smuggled through servants, a melody sung in the dark one that mocked the very king who demanded silence. These fragments of defiance passed quietly from generation to generation, proof that even the most broken could whisper resistance. The selection and training of women for royal service was never just about beauty. It was about control disguised as refinement, power disguised as privilege. Kings didn't want companions, they wanted reflections of their will, perfect, voiceless, and loyal to the point of disappearance. By the time a woman completed her training, she was no longer a person. She was ceremony incarnate, a creature of grace and silence. And when she finally stood before the throne, the king did not see her. He saw himself and smiled. Power in royal courts was never content to be silent. It had to be performed, gilded, sanctified, and witnessed. To rule was not enough. It had to look divine. And for that illusion to endure, someone had to kneel. Throughout empires, the humiliation of women was woven into ceremony. It began with ritual, the slow, deliberate choreography of subjugation disguised as grace. Every gesture, every bow, every whispered word of flattery was rehearsed until obedience became indistinguishable from elegance. When a king entered his court, the women of his household became the architecture of his power. They stood in formation, heads lowered, jewels glimmering like stars bound to orbit. Their presence wasn't ornamental, it was symbolic. Each movement reaffirmed the cosmic order, the ruler as God, the women as his constellation. The ceremony began at dawn. In Ottoman palaces, concubines were awakened by music, bathed, perfumed, and dressed in layers of embroidered silk. They waited silently in corridors, each holding a lamp, until the Sultan's steps echoed through the marble hall. The act of being seen was privilege, the act of speaking was not. When he passed, they bowed, eyes fixed to the floor. Those who looked too long risked exile. Those who looked away too quickly risked offense. In France, the ritual took on another form, refinement as submission. The lever du roi, the king's waking ceremony, involved not just noblemen, but women of rank who attended to his every movement. The spectacle of their attendance reminded all of France that even nobility was service before the crown. Women in pearls stood near the bed of power, smiling through discomfort, as the court treated intimacy as theatre. In Persia, the rituals were draped in poetry. The Shah's wives and courtesans were paraded in gardens to recite verses that praised the ruler's mercy. Each poem was an act of devotion, each word a surrender. The poets who wrote these lines knew their purpose to make obedience sound like love. Some rituals went beyond words. In Mughal India, the emperor's chosen women were summoned during feasts and festivals. Draped in gold-threaded veils, they danced barefoot across marble floors, dusted with saffron and rose petals. Their movements told stories of victory, fertility, and submission. The court called it art, but behind the precision and rhythm was fear of a gesture mistaken, a glance misunderstood. In the Ottoman harem, humiliation hid behind luxury. A concubine who displeased the sultan might be dressed in crimson silk, presented before the court as if honored, and then quietly sent to the Palace of Tears, a place of silent exile. Her beauty became her curse, her obedience, her erasure. The Europeans preferred spectacle to silence. During Tudor reigns, accusations of infidelity were punished through public rituals of shame. Anne Boleyn's final walk to the scaffold was orchestrated with ceremonial detail, white gown, prayer book in hand, every step framed as virtue in defeat. The king who ordered her death called it justice. History remembers it as theatre. The purpose was always the same, to remind the empire that power could sanctify cruelty. By turning punishment into ceremony, kings absolved themselves. Pain was not personal, it was divine protocol. Even pleasure became ritualized control. In the courts of Louis XV, royal supper entertainments blurred lines between feast and inspection. Women from the Parc aux Cerfs, the king's private residence of mistresses, were arranged like a tableau, chosen for conversation, dance, or silence depending on his mood. Every smile was strategy, every sip of wine an unspoken command. In Ming China, imperial concubines participated in the selection of bliss, an elaborate ceremony where they were chosen for service through omens and rituals. The emperor's attendants measured their breath, scent, and pulse before deciding who was fit for intimacy that night. The process was framed as celestial balance, a union of yin and yang ordained by heaven. But beneath the mysticism lay the same logic. The woman was not a person, she was a function. The ritual of humiliation wasn't always overt. Often it lived in subtleties, in the rule that a woman must walk 3 steps behind, in the silence demanded at a banquet, in the smile maintained through insult. The grandest courts perfected invisibility. The ideal woman was not the one most adored, but the one least remembered. Even in death, the ritual persisted. In Egypt and Persia, royal women who bore sons to kings were buried with smaller tombs, their epitaphs praising the ruler more than themselves. Their lives were framed as extensions of his glory. In Europe, queens' portraits often omitted their names entirely, identified only by titles like the king's consort or mother of the heir. Their individuality died before their bodies did. But humiliation as ceremony served another purpose. It entertained. Power demanded an audience, and submission provided the performance. The court applauded devotion, poets romanticized restraint, and painters immortalized surrender. What began as control became culture. Artists depicted royal women as serene and divine, never defiant, never human. In their eyes, obedience was beauty and silence was dignity. The irony was complete. The more a woman was erased, the more she was idealized. At feasts, the king would toast to loyalty while surrounded by the very people his loyalty destroyed. The laughter of courtiers masked fear. Everyone understood that the closer one stood to power, the more humiliating survival became. Yet even within these rituals, traces of rebellion lingered. In private, women repurposed the very ceremonies meant to break them. A concubine might whisper prayers under her breath, not to gods but to her ancestors. A queen might turn a ritual of silence into strategy learning, to listen, to observe, to outlive. History remembers the kings who commanded. It forgets the women who endured. The deeper cruelty of ceremony was that it demanded participation. To survive, a woman had to perform her own subjugation with grace. She had to make it look beautiful. Every bow and every smile was survival disguised as consent. And when the crowd cheered, they weren't applauding obedience, they were applauding endurance. The courts called it loyalty, the poets called it love. But for the women who lived it, it was something far simpler, ritualized imprisonment. And yet those same rituals that were designed to erase them also preserved them. In the records of coronations, banquets, and executions, their names appear faint, secondary, but there. The kings who used them as props are gone, their empires dust. But the women remain in the details, haunting every chronicle that tried to hide them. Because ceremony can silence the voice, but it cannot erase the memory of the breath that once spoke beneath it. History has always adored its illusions. The palace glittered, the portraits smiled, and the world called it grace. Yet behind every jeweled crown and painted fan lay a truth so fragile that it needed gold to hide it. Women's pain had become beautiful. The world did not merely tolerate their humiliation, it celebrated it. The transformation began in art. Kings and chroniclers understood that cruelty needed polish, and artists provided it. Court painters softened bruises with light, turned restraint into posture, and captured despair as divine stillness. A bowed head became serenity. Averted eyes became virtue. The body that trembled in obedience was rendered as elegance. Thus, humiliation was immortalized not as tragedy, but as taste. In the courts of Europe, the royal portrait became the empire's most seductive lie. Queens were painted with hands folded, eyes lowered, their silence mistaken for wisdom. Mistresses were shown half smiling, their bare shoulders suggesting power disguised as intimacy. Every brushstroke rewrote reality. The artist was not recording truth, he was manufacturing devotion. The same women who lived under constant fear were transformed into symbols of refinement. Their suffering fed the aesthetics of empire. Poets followed the painters. They turned captivity into metaphor. Sonnets described women as gentle flames, obedient roses, soft chains. In French salons and Persian courts alike, verses celebrated submission as purity and endurance as beauty. The cruelest irony was that the world began to envy them. Women outside the palace read about queens in captivity and imagined romance, not confinement. Servitude became aspiration. In Ottoman and Mughal courts, miniature artists painted harems as gardens of paradise fountains, silk drapes, laughter frozen in pigment. The air of secrecy made it irresistible. Western travelers, barred from entering, filled the void with fantasy. Their journals described sensual paradises guarded by jealousy, where women waited like living jewels for the master's glance. They called it exotic, erotic, enchanting, never enslaved. The myth of the harem became Europe's favorite dream, proof that even captivity could be made to sparkle if the cage was gilded enough. Music added another layer of deception. At royal banquets, orchestras played as women danced, their movements choreographed to display both grace and obedience. The rhythm of their humiliation became entertainment. When a dancer's anklets jingled in perfect time, courtiers applauded her skill, not her submission. Every melody was applause for control disguised as culture. Writers of morality joined the chorus. Philosophers argued that women's restraint preserved civilization. Theologians praised modesty as divine order. To endure was to be holy. The queen who forgave infidelity was saintly. The mistress who endured neglect was loyal. The slave who smiled through pain was graceful. The entire vocabulary of virtue was rewritten to flatter power. Even fashion became part of the performance. Corsets that crushed ribs in Europe, foot binding in China, the heavy veils of the East, all claimed to symbolize dignity or beauty. In truth, they were instruments of control masquerading as ornament. To move beautifully, a woman first had to hurt. The slower her step, the more desirable her presence, the more fragile her body, the more powerful her image. Pain was elegance, endurance was status. The public loved it. The more women suffered, the more they were mythologized. Ballads told of faithful queens who died for love, courtesans who poisoned themselves for honor, dancers who performed until their feet bled. These stories were not warnings, they were spectacles. The audience mistook tragedy for devotion and called it romance. The deception extended beyond royal walls. Pain filtered down into culture. Common women were told to imitate their betters, to speak softly, to bear silently, to forgive endlessly. The ideal woman became one who could suffer beautifully. The line between dignity and submission blurred until the world could no longer tell them apart. The poets of empire ensured that beauty never appeared without obedience. They described eyes that obeyed, voices that trembled with duty, smiles that accepted fate. Their verses became scripture for the social order. Every kingdom needed its angels' women whose wings were clipped so delicately that they forgot they once could fly. Even when the world began to modernize, the myth persisted. The 19th century romantics resurrected the same imagery, pale heroines dying of heartbreak, muses who inspired genius but owned no story of their own. The king was gone, but his script survived. Pain remained the proof of love. Silence remained the shape of grace. Behind these illusions, economies thrived. The labor of women's restraint built dynasties of luxury. Jewels, perfumes, fabrics, all depended on the uncredited artistry of those who were never allowed to claim it. The embroidery on a royal robe, the fragrance of a banquet hall, the choreography of a court dance, they were created by invisible hands that history would later forget. The beauty of empire was quite literally stitched from submission. The audience of power widened as centuries passed. Where kings once watched from thrones, entire societies now watched through art and gossip. The humiliation of women remained public spectacle, simply rebranded as fascination. Every whispered scandal, every idealized love story, every painting of eternal grace served the same purpose, to keep suffering aesthetic. But within that beauty, cracks appeared. Letters from queens, diaries from mistresses, and fragments of poetry written in secret began to surface. They revealed the price of that splendor: sleeplessness, isolation, fear, and the quiet awareness that the world preferred them perfect rather than free. "I am loved as a statue," one French noblewoman wrote, "because statues do not speak." These confessions shattered the myth, but too late. The mask of splendor had already become tradition. Even rebellion was absorbed by the spectacle. A woman who resisted could still be painted as tragic, still be romanticized in her fall. The system could turn even defiance into decoration. The ultimate cruelty was not pain but admiration. When the world applauded the beauty of their suffering, it guaranteed its survival. The court did not need chains when it had praise. A woman who believed her endurance was noble would preserve her own cage. That was the genius of royal control to make humiliation desirable. Centuries later, the images remain. Museums hang portraits of veiled queens and sighing mistresses. Tourists gaze at them and whisper words like elegant and mysterious, unaware that they are still participating in the same ritual, worshipping the grace that pain created. The empire's cruelty outlived its thrones because it learned to disguise itself as art. And yet, every masterpiece tells on itself. Look closely at those painted faces, the tension in the jaw, the faint shadow under the eye, the stiffness of the smile. Beneath the perfection lies exhaustion. The beauty was never theirs, it was the world's reflection polished on their silence. In the end, the mask of splendor achieved what swords and laws could not. It made oppression immortal. Power no longer needed to command obedience. It simply taught the world to admire it. And admiration is the most loyal prison of all. Empires collapse, thrones crack, crowns lose their shine. But the idea that built them, the belief that control is sacred and submission is beautiful, survives long after the marble turns to dust. The women who once bowed before kings are gone, yet the rules they were forced to obey still govern the world that replaced them. The kingdoms didn't vanish, they multiplied. The palaces became offices, studios, and screens. The courtiers became managers, admirers, and audiences. And the rituals of obedience that once unfolded beneath chandeliers now happen beneath spotlights and algorithms. The setting changed, but the story stayed the same. Today, women no longer kneel in royal courts. They stand beneath harsher lights, the ones that never turn off. Every post, picture, and performance becomes a new kind of ceremony. Perfection must still be rehearsed. Beauty must still obey invisible rules. The same hunger that once made kings collect concubines now makes industries collect followers. The same power that branded women with royal names now brands them with digital identities. The Iron Crown has become a filter. The audience is bigger, but the expectation is older than civilization, that women must still perform grace inside cages. The palaces of today are built from attention, a currency even more demanding than gold. It rewards compliance, punishes defiance, and disguises servitude as freedom. When a woman posts her best self to the world, she plays the same dangerous game royal courtesans once did, balancing admiration against autonomy. The echo of monarchy still hums beneath modern life. It lives in how society praises silence as dignity and humility as charm. It lives in how ambition is forgiven in men but feared in women. It lives in how endurance is romanticized and how beauty is still defined by what it hides. The court is gone, but the choreography remains. Modern fashion borrows its discipline from palaces. High heels mimic bound feet. Corsets have returned, rebranded as empowerment. The cosmetics that claim liberation echo the powders and paints that once erased Queen's exhaustion. The slogans have changed: choice, confidence, self-expression. But the mirror's gaze is still imperial. The ideal woman remains polished, composed, and silent. She still moves within the boundaries of approval, still performs her worth for an unseen crown. The entertainment world, too, keeps the ritual alive. The public loves to watch women rise and fall, adoration followed by outrage, devotion followed by destruction. The pattern is ancient. Every scandal is a reenactment of court gossip. Every downfall a royal execution in digital form. When the crowd condemns a woman for being too proud, too loud or too much. They echo the whispers of courtiers who once destroyed queens with the same words. The tragedy of history is not that kings existed, but that we learned to admire them. We inherited their gaze, the one that measures women through spectacle. Even rebellion is judged by its beauty. A woman who suffers gracefully is applauded. One who resists openly is condemned. The scale of control is subtle now, but its logic remains imperial. And yet the story is changing. The silence that once preserved power has begun to fracture. Across the world, the descendants of those forgotten women speak through film, art, literature, and the very platforms that once demanded perfection. Their voices do what history refused to do. Name the cruelty that wore gold and called itself love. Each confession, each reclamation, each act of defiance becomes a new chapter in an unwritten book, the counter-history of endurance. The women who were painted as ornaments are now authors. The ones who were trained to perform obedience are now teaching rebellion. Their legacy is not in their submission, but in their survival. Because even under the heaviest crown, there were always cracks. Behind the perfect portrait, there was always a pulse. Every time a woman endured humiliation and lived, she carried forward the possibility of freedom. Empires are built on obedience, but history moves forward on defiance. The modern world often congratulates itself for progress, forgetting that progress is not the absence of oppression, it's the awareness of it. We may no longer see chains, but we still feel them in expectation. We may no longer witness ceremonies of humiliation, but we scroll through them every day, choreographed in advertisements, music videos, and the quiet exhaustion of pretending to be enough. Yet awareness changes everything. When we begin to see the pattern, the performance breaks. The same rituals that once glorified submission can be rewritten as art, protest, and testimony. When a woman tells her story without shame, she becomes what empires feared most, a mirror that reflects truth instead of obedience. The thrones may have fallen, but the psychology of power still searches for worship. It finds it in the admiration we give to perfection, in the envy we feel toward beauty, in the reverence we hold for control. But every act of self-expression, every refusal to conform, every voice that refuses silence, chips away at the invisible kingdom that still claims our minds. The legacy of royal control is not only historical, it's emotional. It lives inside us in how we define strength, how we measure love, how we mistake suffering for virtue. To destroy it, we must unlearn the admiration that sustains it. We must look at beauty and ask who paid for it. We must look at power and ask who was silenced for it. The empires that built their glory on obedience wanted to be eternal. They believed their rituals could outlast time. But the truth is simpler. No crown can survive the memory of those it oppressed. The monuments crumble, the ceremonies fade, and the names of kings vanish. What endures are the scars and the stories written through them. The world still wears the ornaments of its old cruelty, but it also carries the seed of its undoing. Every truth spoken aloud, every silence broken, every act of refusal is an empire falling in miniature. The kingdoms they built were vast, but the kingdoms they couldn't kill were within the women who outlived them. Because power can command obedience, but it cannot erase memory. And memory, once awakened, becomes its own revolution.